Dr. Elena Reyes had been awake for 36 hours when the call came through. The notification lit up her phone at 4:47 a.m., cutting through the darkness of her Seattle apartment with clinical precision. She didn't need to look at the screen to know it was the private line, the one connected to the Columbia Cascades Wildlife Observatory, the one that only rang when protocols demanded immediate attention, the one that had remained silent for the better part of 18 months. "Reyes," she answered, already pulling on yesterday's field clothes. "We have a situation." Marcus Webb's voice carried the kind of controlled tension that came from years of managing crisis without spectacle. As the observatory's director of field operations, Webb had seen black bears dismantle research stations, cougars stalk camera crews, and one memorable incident involving a territorial elk and a graduate student's thesis equipment. But there was something different in his tone now, something that made Elena's hands still on her bootlaces. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where you need to see it for yourself. I'm sending coordinates. Come alone, and Elena..." He paused, and in that silence she heard the weight of something unspoken. "Bring your Protocol 7 clearance." Protocol 7. The designation existed in their operational manual as a theoretical framework, a checkbox for institutional completeness. It covered encounters with unknown primate species, scenarios that belong more to cryptozoology wishful thinking than legitimate field biology. Elena had helped draft those protocols during her first year at the observatory, treating them with the same academic seriousness she'd apply to any systematic documentation standard, never imagining they'd be invoked. The coordinates led her 2 hours northeast into the Cascade Range, where autumn had painted the slopes in rust and amber. The sun was barely cresting the ridgeline when she turned onto the unmarked Forest Service Road, following it until asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, then finally the kind of two-track that disappeared beneath Douglas fir needles and sword fern fronds. Webb was waiting at the trailhead with 2 other researchers she recognized: Kara Chen, their senior wildlife biologist, and David Ortiz, who managed their network of motion-activated cameras across 1,600 square miles of wilderness. All 3 were expressions that sat uncomfortably between professional composure and something she couldn't quite name. "Before we go up there," Webb said without preamble, "I need you to understand what you're about to see breaks every assumption we've operated under. It challenges foundational principles, and it absolutely cannot leave this group until we've established a framework for handling it." Elena felt her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. "Show me." They hiked in silence, following a game trail that wound through old-growth forest, where the canopy filtered morning light into cathedral dimness. The air smelled of decay and regeneration, that particular Pacific Northwest perfume of rot-feeding new growth. Ortiz led them to a clearing roughly 40 meters across, where a small stream cut through moss-covered stones. In the center of the clearing, placed with obvious deliberation on a flat boulder at chest height, sat one of their trail cameras. Elena recognized it immediately, a Reckonix Hyperfire model, weatherproof casing intact, the small serial number sticker she'd applied herself during deployment cataloging last spring. Unit 47NC, positioned 6.2 miles northeast of this location to monitor a black bear corridor. "It was taken 3 weeks ago," Ortiz said quietly. "Motion sensors recorded something approaching at 03:14 hours on September 28th. The footage shows movement, large. Then the camera angle shifts, goes dark. We logged it as a technical failure, started planning retrieval when weather permitted." "But you didn't retrieve it," Eleanor said, already understanding. "It retrieved itself." Kara's voice carried the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation, stripped it of emotion until only facts remained. 2 days ago, our routine drone survey picked up anomalous placement here. We investigated yesterday. The camera was exactly as you see it, positioned deliberately, untouched by weather. No animal disturbance to the placement site. Elena approached slowly, noting details her training demanded she catalog. The boulder was clear of debris, as if something had swept it clean. The camera faced north, toward the trail they'd descended, angled slightly upward in a way that suggested understanding of its function. No scratches marred the casing, no tooth marks, no impact damage. "Have you reviewed the footage?" she asked. Webb handed her a tablet, already queued to the relevant files. "Everything from the moment of removal until approximately 6 hours before we found it. 47 gigabytes across 19 days. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the device. The first clips showed exactly what Ortiz had described, standard nighttime footage of the original installation site, rendered in grayscale infrared. A deer passed through at 02:33, nothing at 02:47. Then, at 03:14, movement entered the frame's periphery. The resolution captured details with unforgiving clarity. She saw a hand, there was no other word for it, despite what her training insisted she call it, enter the frame. The proportions were wrong for human anatomy. The palm broader, fingers longer, the entire structure suggesting immense strength in its thickness. Dark hair covered the visible skin, dense enough to obscure details, but not enough to hide the deliberate precision of movement. The hand gripped the camera mount, and the image shuddered, twisted, went briefly dark. When clarity returned, the perspective had shifted. Now the camera faced outward, capturing its bearer from an impossible angle as if held at arm's length. Elena's breath caught. The face that filled the screen defied categorization. The infrared rendering stripped away color, reduced features to topology and heat signature. But even in monochrome, the intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. The brow ridge was pronounced, the jaw powerful, the nose broad and human-adjacent. Hair framed the face in thick waves, and when the mouth opened, not in threat but in what looked disturbingly like investigation, she counted teeth that spoke to omnivorous adaptation. "It's examining the camera," Kara said unnecessarily. "Watch how it manipulates the housing." The footage continued. The subject, Elena forced herself to use clinical terminology, turned the camera, studying it from multiple angles. Fingers that should have been clumsy with their bulk instead moved with careful precision, testing the weatherproof seals, the mounting bracket, even the small SD card door. At one point, it held the camera close to its face, and Elena realized with a start that it was looking directly into the lens, understanding that something existed on the other side of that glass eye. Then the subject did something that made Elena's scientific framework crack at its foundations. It held up its other hand, positioning it clearly in frame, and deliberately extended 3 fingers. It held this position for several seconds, then closed its hand and extended 4 fingers, then 5. Then it reversed the sequence. 5, 4, 3. "It's counting," Elena whispered. "It gets better," Webb said, though his tone suggested better was perhaps the wrong word, or worse, depending on your perspective. Skip ahead to timestamp 47:22:31. Elena navigated through the footage, watching as daylight transformed the infrared into full color. The forest resolved into familiar detail. The subject had traveled during the night, moving through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. Yet the footage remained steady, suggesting deliberate care for the equipment. The timestamp showed morning of the 3rd day after removal. The camera now rested on what appeared to be a fallen log, positioned to capture a small clearing similar to the one where they currently stood. As Eleanor watched, the subject entered the frame from the left, now fully visible in autumn daylight. The body stood perhaps 7.5 feet tall, covered in hair that ranged from dark brown to auburn, where sunlight caught it. The musculature suggested massive power, but the posture was upright, fully bipedal, the gait fluid and purposeful. It moved like something that belonged in this environment, that had adapted to these forests over generations beyond counting. But what arrested Elena's attention was what the subject carried. An assemblage of stones, carefully selected and graded by size. The subject arranged these on the fallen log, then stepped back, looking toward the camera as if confirming it was recording. Then it began to teach. The sequence was methodical, undeniable. The subject arranged the stones in groups, 2 here, 3 there. It pointed to each group, touched them in sequence, then gestured broadly as if indicating the sum. It repeated the demonstration with different combinations, each time ensuring the camera captured the entire sequence. "It knows what cameras do," Ortiz said. "It understands documentation, transmission of information across time, and it's using our equipment to send a message." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. In her career studying primate cognition, she'd witnessed remarkable behaviors: tool use, social learning, even rudimentary symbol manipulation in captive great apes. But this was different. This was intentional communication across species boundaries, directed toward an unknown audience, with apparent understanding of technological mediation. "There's more," Tara said. "Much more. Skip to day 7. The footage became a window into impossible ethnography. Over the following days, the subject returned repeatedly, each visit adding layers to a growing curriculum. It demonstrated knowledge of local flora, which plants were edible, which held medicinal properties. It showed the camera tracks in dried mud, interpreting the signatures of deer, bear, smaller predators. It built a rudimentary shelter from branches and bark, the construction technique efficient and clearly practiced. On day 9, it brought someone else. The second subject was smaller, more slender, with lighter coloration and features that suggested, though Eleanor was cautious about projection, a younger individual, perhaps female. The two interacted with obvious familiarity, their movements coordinated, their communication involving sounds that the camera's audio captured as low-frequency vocalizations below typical human range, punctuated by clicks and what sounded disturbingly like laughter. They groomed each other, the gesture intimate and careful. They shared food, wild mushrooms, roots, what looked like fresh-caught fish, and they both acknowledged the camera, sometimes looking directly into the lens as if aware of their audience. "It's introducing us," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. "It's showing us family, social structure, culture." "Keep watching," Webb said. On day 12, the subjects demonstrated something that sent chills down Eleanor's spine. They led the camera's view, obviously carrying it now, to a location marked by deliberate stone arrangements. The stones had been shaped, worked with other rocks to create flat surfaces, and on these surfaces, marks had been etched. Not random scratchings, but organized patterns, lines in groups, circles, crosses. The markings resembled tally systems, calendrical notations, the kind of proto-writing that archaeologists associated with early human cognitive evolution. The primary subject pointed to specific groupings, then to the sky, then to trees where bark had been stripped in patterns that might represent seasons, phases, cycles of meaning. "They have writing," Tara said flatly, "or something analogous. Symbolic representation, information storage, external to memory." Elena's mind raced through implications. If this was genuine, and she was watching it with her own eyes, captured by equipment she herself had deployed, then everything about human uniqueness, about the cognitive revolution that supposedly separated Homo sapiens from other lineages, needed revision. On day 16, the footage turned darker. The subjects appeared agitated, their movements sharp with tension. The primary subject positioned the camera carefully, ensuring it captured what came next. Then it began to draw in the dirt. Simple pictographs, but their meaning was clear. It drew humanoid figures, some larger, some smaller. Then it drew a shape that unmistakably represented a human with a rifle. It drew this figure repeatedly, surrounding the other shapes, and then it swept the whole diagram away with violent strokes. "It's warning us," Elena said, "or asking for help, or both." The subsequent footage showed the subjects moving through forest with obvious evasion tactics, avoiding open areas, traveling along ridgelines where tracks would be minimal, sometimes moving through water to eliminate scent trails. At one point, distant sounds of dogs barking caused both subjects to freeze, then rapidly relocate. The final footage, recorded 2 days before the camera's discovery, showed the primary subject alone. It sat before the camera and for several minutes simply looked into the lens. The expression was impossible to read with certainty, but Eleanor saw something in those eyes that spoke to shared understanding, the recognition of intelligence meeting intelligence, and all the complicated weight that carried. Then the subject carefully wrapped the camera in large leaves, bound with flexible bark strips, and the footage went dark. "When we found it," Ortiz said, "the protective wrapping was still intact. The camera had been kept dry, protected from impact. It was cared for." Eleanor lowered the tablet, her hands shaking now without pretense. "We need to classify this under Protocol 7 immediately. Complete information quarantine until we establish contact procedures that prioritize their safety and autonomy." "Already done," Webb said. "But that's not why I invoked your clearance specifically. There's something else you need to see, something the camera captured on the last day that changes everything." He took the tablet, navigated to a file marked with timestamp encryption. This footage was recorded in the final 2 hours before the subject returned the camera. The audio capture is significant. Elena watched as the primary subject appeared again, but now in what looked like a deliberately cleared space, a meeting ground of sorts. It positioned the camera carefully, then stepped back, and then it began to vocalize. The sounds were complex, modulated, structured. They rose and fell with patterns that suggested phonemic organization, and beneath the obvious foreignness, Elena heard something that made her blood run cold with recognition. The prosodic patterns, the rhythmic structure, the way sounds clustered and separated, all of it suggested something terrifyingly, beautifully familiar. It was language. Not mere communication, but symbolic, recursive, generative language. The subject vocalized for nearly 10 minutes, sometimes gesturing to emphasize points, sometimes looking directly at the camera as if ensuring attention. Then it fell silent, approached the camera, and made one final gesture. It placed its hand flat against the lens, fingers spread, holding the position for several seconds before carefully wrapping the equipment for return. "We ran the audio through linguistic analysis software," Webb said quietly. "The phonemic diversity, the non-random distribution of sound clusters, the presence of what appear to be repeated semantic units. It all suggests structured communication at a level consistent with human language complexity." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't articulate whether they were from wonder or grief. "What do we call them?" "That's precisely the question," Kara said. "Taxonomy implies ownership, scientific classification. But these are people, Elena. Whatever their evolutionary relationship to us, whatever anatomical differences exist, these are clearly persons under any cognitive or ethical framework." "We can't announce this," Ortiz said, his voice tight. "Not yet, not until we understand the implications." The footage showed them evading what looked like hunters, possibly poachers. "If word gets out, if their location becomes known, we have an obligation," Elena interrupted. "To them, first and foremost. The footage shows them deliberately reaching out, choosing communication. They've given us something extraordinary: trust, knowledge, evidence of their existence. Our response can't be exploitation or exposure." "Agreed," Webb said, "which is why we're implementing full Protocol 7 containment. The camera stays secured, the footage stays encrypted, and everyone with knowledge signs expanded NDAs. We proceed with contact protocols that assume full personhood and self-determination. We protect their secrecy as if their lives depend on it, because they clearly do." Eleanor looked back at the boulder where the camera had been placed, understanding now the weight of what had occurred in this clearing. A hand had reached across the boundary between human knowledge and lived mystery, not in spectacle or drama, but in the quiet dignity of intelligence recognizing itself in another. They'd been offered something precious beyond measure, not proof of existence for scientific glory, but an invitation to relationship built on respect and mutual understanding. "We need to respond," she said. "They sent a message. They deserve an answer." "How do you propose we do that?" Kara asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking through implications, risks, ethical frameworks. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of certainty that came from recognizing one's life dividing into before and after. "We leave a camera. We show them that we received their message, that we understand, that we choose to protect rather than expose. We document our own lives, our work, our intention, and we wait. We let them decide what comes next." Webb nodded slowly. Protocol 7, Section D. Establishing non-intrusive contact with previously uncontacted populations. I'll authorize the deployment. "There's one more thing," Ortiz said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested revelation. "When we were cataloging the original footage, we found something in the metadata. The camera has a timestamp function that records not just when footage is captured, but the intervals between recording sessions. Based on power consumption patterns, the subjects kept the camera powered on for specific durations each day. Always the same length of time, always starting at the same position relative to sunrise. They were studying it," Elena said. "Learning how it functions, understanding the technology." "More than that," Ortiz continued, "the power cycles match circadian patterns. They were adapting their behavior to the camera's limitations, working within its battery constraints, demonstrating technological understanding sophisticated enough to reverse engineer operational parameters." Eleanor felt the implications cascade. Tool use, symbolic thought, structured language, technological comprehension. Each trait once considered uniquely human, now demonstrated by a lineage that had somehow remained hidden in plain sight, adapting and surviving in the margins of human expansion. "How is this possible?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "How could a population of primates, this cognitively sophisticated, this physically imposing, remain undiscovered for so long?" "Maybe they weren't undiscovered," Kara said quietly. "Maybe they were just very, very good at staying hidden. And maybe we were very, very good at dismissing the evidence when it surfaced." The sun had fully risen now, filtering through the canopy in shafts that illuminated dancing dust motes and spider silk. The clearing seemed different to Elena now, not merely a space in the forest, but a meeting ground, a carefully chosen neutral territory where boundaries could be negotiated and understanding attempted. "I need to analyze everything," Elena said. "The anatomical details, the locomotion patterns, the social behaviors. If we're going to protect them, we need to understand their vulnerabilities, their resource needs, their range requirements. And we need to understand the threats," Webb added. "The footage shows clear evasion of human presence. We need to identify who might be searching for them, what rumors might be circulating, what gaps in our coverage might expose them." They began the hike back, each carrying the weight of impossible knowledge. Elena's exhaustion had transformed into something else, a clarity born of purpose, sharp as the October air. She thought about the protocols they'd drafted as academic exercise, now suddenly critical framework for navigating the most significant discovery in primatology, anthropology, perhaps all of human history. But more than discovery, it was encounter. Two lineages of intelligence, separated by time and evolution, reaching across that divide with careful deliberation. The subjects, she needed a better term, recognized that subject carried implications of observation and study that seemed wrong now, had chosen communication. They'd taken a tool designed to watch them and transformed it into a medium for dialogue. What did they see, Elena wondered, when they looked into the camera lens? What did they understand about the world beyond the forest, about the technological civilization that encroached ever closer to their hidden refuges? What stories did they carry, passed down through generations, about encounters with humans, some perhaps hostile, others merely indifferent, all ultimately dangerous in their potential for discovery and disruption? Back at the trailhead, Webb's satellite phone buzzed with Incoming data. He checked the screen, his expression tightening. We have a problem. The Regional Forest Service office flagged unusual activity 3 miles west of here. Trail camera thefts, reports of large animal sightings, and a hunting party that's applied for special permits, citing dangerous predator concerns. Timeline? Eleanor asked. They're scheduled to begin operations next week. 6 hunters, dogs, high-powered rifles rated for elk and bear. Elena felt cold certainty settle over her. They know, maybe not specifically, but they've seen signs, heard stories. They're hunting for what returned the camera. We need to warn them, Kara said immediately. The family, the population, whatever their group structure is, they need to know about the immediate threat. How? Ortiz asked. We don't know their location, their range. The camera was moved over 19 days. They could be anywhere in several hundred square miles. Elena thought back to the footage, the careful demonstrations, the deliberate communication. They'll come back. They left the camera in a location where they knew we'd find it, which means they're monitoring our sites, our patterns. If we deploy a response, they'll see it. Then we do it now, Webb said. Today, we place a camera at this location with footage showing the threat, hunters, dates, locations. We make it clear we're providing warning, not cooperation with the hunting party. And we mark the area, Elena added. Every site within 5 miles gets flagged as critical research territory under federal protection. We invoke the Endangered Species Act preliminarily, cite potential habitat for species of concern. It won't stop private land access, but it'll slow down any activity on federal parcels. They worked quickly, Webb coordinating with the observatory's legal team, while Kara and Ortiz began compiling threat documentation. Elena focused on the response message, thinking through how to communicate across the vast gap of different cognition, different experience, different understanding of the world. She recorded herself speaking clearly to the camera, knowing audio analysis had shown comprehension of phonemic complexity even if specific semantic content remained opaque. She showed maps, marked with human symbols for danger, skull and crossbones, the universal warnings that transcended linguistic barriers. She demonstrated the hunters' weapons, using stock photos and video, making clear their lethality. Then she did something that felt simultaneously foolish and necessary. She placed her hand against the camera lens, fingers spread, mirroring the final gesture from the returned footage, a sign of acknowledgement, of understanding, of shared humanity in the broadest possible sense. By late afternoon, they had deployed the response camera at the clearing center, positioned exactly where the original had been returned. Around it, they placed stones in deliberate arrangement, a human echo of the patterned markers they'd seen in the footage, an attempt to signal intentionality and respect. Now we wait, Webb said. And hope they understand, Kara added. Elena looked at the forest surrounding them, the ancient trees and shadowed understory, the countless hidden spaces where a careful observer could remain unseen indefinitely. Somewhere in that wilderness, a family moved through their territory, navigating dangers both ancient and modern, carrying knowledge and culture that had survived against impossible odds. They had reached out once. She had to trust they would come back, would receive the warning, would understand that not all humans represented threat, that some chose witness over spectacle, protection over exposure, relationship over exploitation. As the sun lowered toward the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing, Elena made a silent promise to the impossible people who'd returned their camera with such careful grace. Whatever came next, however this story unfolded, she would honor their choice to communicate with everything her training and ethics could provide. The footage wasn't meant for humans generally, perhaps, but it had been given to humans specifically, deliberately, and that made all the difference. The response camera vanished on the 3rd night. Elena saw it in real time through the live monitoring feed she'd set up in her apartment, the kind of obsessive vigilance that left her sleeping in 2-hour shifts between checks. At 3:47 a.m., movement registered on the edge of the frame, a shape resolving from darkness, careful and deliberate. The infrared captured what daylight had previously shown, a massive figure moving with the forest, rather than through it, understanding shadow and stillness in ways that spoke to generations of successful evasion. The figure approached the camera directly, no pretense of avoidance. It studied the device for several long moments, then carefully examined the stone arrangement they'd left. One hand reached out, fingers tracing the pattern with obvious recognition. Then the figure looked directly into the lens, and even through digital compression and infrared rendering, Elena saw acknowledgement in those eyes. The camera lifted from its mount with careful precision. The last image transmitted before the connection died showed the sky wheeling overhead, stars visible through gaps in the canopy, then nothing. "They got our message," Elena said into the darkness of her apartment, equal parts relief and trepidation. The waiting began again, but different now, charged with anticipation, weighted with responsibility. Webb implemented full Protocol 7 containment across the observatory, restricting access to the area under guise of sensitive habitat monitoring. Kara established connection with the Forest Service, leveraging relationships and academic credentials to flag the region for biological survey that would, conveniently, overlap with the hunting party's requested permits. "We've bought time," Webb told Elena during a secure call 3 days after the camera's removal. "The permits are delayed, pending environmental assessment, but that's 90 days maximum, and if they push back through legal channels, we'll have to provide specificity about what we're protecting, which we can't do without exposing them," Elena finished. "Exactly. So we need alternative strategies. I'm working on expanding our land conservation partnerships, seeing if we can establish protective corridors that appear routine but cover their likely range. Meanwhile, you focus on understanding them, everything the footage tells us about their biology, cognition, social structure. We need to anticipate their needs if we're going to protect them effectively." Elena had already begun the analysis, frame-by-frame review that consumed her waking hours. The anatomical details fascinated and troubled her in equal measure. The skeletal structure visible in certain movements suggested adaptation to bipedalism more complete than any other great ape lineage. The spine positioned for upright walking, the pelvis broad and sturdy, the legs proportioned for distance coverage rather than climbing specialization, yet they clearly retained arboreal capabilities. Footage showed them moving through trees with astonishing fluidity, using upper body strength that dwarfed human capacity. The feet were remarkable, broad and flexible, with apparent prehensile capability in the toes, providing purchase on varied terrain that would challenge equipped hikers. The hands displayed even more sophisticated adaptation, the thumb opposed fully, allowing precision grip that the footage demonstrated in careful manipulation of small objects. But the overall structure suggested power rather than the gracile delicacy of human hands. These were appendages capable of both crude force and fine motor control, evolved for survival in an environment that demanded versatility. What kept Elena awake, though, beyond the remarkable anatomy, was the cognitive capacity so clearly evident in every recorded interaction. The teaching sequences weren't simple demonstration. They showed pedagogical intent, understanding of audience knowledge gaps, structured progression from simple to complex concepts. This implied not just intelligence, but metacognition, the ability to model another mind's understanding and adjust communication accordingly. The stone markings haunted her. She'd sent images to colleagues specializing in paleoanthropology, carefully framed as speculative discussion of early human symbol systems, and their analysis confirmed her instinct. The patterns showed organizational principles consistent with proto-writing, externalized memory storage that transcended oral tradition. which meant they had culture in the anthropological sense, not just tool use or social learning, but accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations through symbolic means. They had history, recorded and preserved. They had information systems. They had, in effect, literature. On the seventh day after the response camera's removal, Elena received a call from Ortiz at 5:22 a.m. His voice carried controlled excitement. "We have a return. Different location, but unambiguous. You need to see this now." She made the drive in record time, following new coordinates to a location 4 miles southeast of the original clearing. The site was more remote, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The forest here felt older, less touched by recent human activity, the kind of place where silence had depth and weight. The camera sat on a fallen log that had decomposed into a rich ecosystem of moss and fungi. But the camera wasn't alone. Arranged around it in careful display were objects, gifts, Elena realized immediately, or perhaps offerings, each chosen with obvious intentionality. There were stones, shaped and smoothed by water, arranged by color gradation from dark to light. Feathers from various birds, organized by size. A collection of pine cones from different conifer species, their distinctive patterns on clear display. And something that made Elena's breath catch. Woven cordage, created from plant fibers with a technique sophisticated enough to produce consistent thickness and surprising strength. "They're showing us their material culture," Kara said quietly, having arrived moments before Elena. "These aren't random forest objects. These are crafted items, curated collections. This is a museum display." Elena approached slowly, documenting everything with her phone before daring to touch. The woven cordage particularly fascinated her. The fibers had been processed, probably soaked and beaten to separate and soften them, then twisted with even tension. This required knowledge of specific plants, understanding of processing techniques, and manual dexterity far beyond what mainstream primatology attributed to non-human apes. "Have you checked the camera footage?" Elena asked. Ortiz nodded, handing her a tablet. 236 gigabytes across 10 days. "They've been busy." The footage opened on a scene that immediately explained the location change. The camera captured a gathering space, a clearing perhaps 20 meters across, where the forest floor had been deliberately maintained. Large rocks positioned as seating, the ground cleared of obstruction, sightlines managed for what could only be called architectural intent. Over the following hours of footage, Elena witnessed something extraordinary. The daily life of a family group, filmed from a fixed perspective they'd clearly chosen to share. There were 7 individuals visible across various recordings. 3 adults of varying sizes, 2 adolescents, and 2 young ones who moved with the boundless energy and curiosity of children in any species. They cooked. That detail struck Elena with visceral force. They constructed fire with practiced ease using a bow drill technique, controlled the flames with careful fuel management, and used the heat to process food, roasting roots until they softened, warming fish wrapped in leaves, even heating stones to crack open nuts that would resist raw consumption. They manufactured tools. An adult, the primary figure from the original footage, she recognized, spent nearly an hour on camera working a piece of bone into a pointed implement, using other stones as hammers and abraders, demonstrating understanding of material properties and functional design. They played. The juveniles engaged in what could only be called games, chasing each other through elaborate patterns, wrestling with obvious restraint to avoid injury, manipulating objects in ways that suggested both amusement and skill development. And they communicated constantly. The audio captured vocalizations ranging from deep rumbles to higher-pitched calls, modulated with patterns that suggested semantic content. They gestured while vocalizing, sometimes placing hands on each other's shoulders or touching faces in ways that seemed to emphasize or soften the accompanying sounds. "Watch day 4, Ortiz said, navigating to a specific timestamp. "Morning sequence, around 07:30. The footage showed the primary adult approaching the camera, accompanied by one of the juveniles, a smaller individual with lighter coloring and features that read as feminine under any mammalian framework. The adult positioned the juvenile before the camera, then stepped back slightly, remaining visible at frame's edge. The juvenile held something cupped in both hands, hiding it from view. The adult vocalized, a series of sounds with clear intonational patterns rising at the end in what linguists would recognize as interrogative structure. The juvenile responded with its own sounds, shorter and higher pitched, then opened its hands to reveal a small object. It was a carving, created from wood, with techniques that left tool marks clearly visible. The shape was abstract but suggestive, a vertical form with suggestions of a head, torso, limbs, a figure. The juvenile held this up to the camera, turning it slowly so its dimensionality could be appreciated. Representational art, Kara whispered. Figurative sculpture, that's symbolic abstraction at the highest level. The adult vocalized again, and the juvenile carefully placed the carving on the ground before the camera, positioning it with obvious care. Then both figures looked directly into the lens, and the adult raised one hand in what had become a recognizable gesture, open palm, fingers spread. A greeting, an acknowledgement, a bridge across impossible distance. Eleanor felt tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "They're teaching us their language," she said. "Not just showing us artifacts, but demonstrating context, social learning, family structure. They're anthropologists studying us while letting us study them." The subsequent footage reinforced this interpretation. Different individuals took turns approaching the camera, each demonstrating specific skills or knowledge domains. An elder figure, distinguishable by silver coloring in the facial hair and slightly stiff movement, showed processing of various plants, carefully handling each one, sometimes consuming small portions, other times explicitly avoiding contact, creating a visual pharmacopoeia. The adolescents demonstrated their learning, attempting techniques shown by adults with varying success. Elena watched one young individual struggle to create fire, the bow drill slipping repeatedly before finally achieving ember. The attending adult didn't intervene directly, but adjusted the youth's hand position through gesture and gentle physical guidance, teaching methodology that any human parent would recognize. On day 7, something shifted. The footage showed the family group moving with obvious agitation, their vocalizations sharper, their movements quick. They abandoned the gathering space rapidly, and for the next several hours, the camera recorded only empty clearing, with distant sounds of disturbance, dogs barking, human voices, the mechanical whine of ATVs. "The hunting party," Webb said grimly. He'd joined them after Kara's urgent call. "They're operating on private land adjacent to the federal parcels we protected, completely legal and completely dangerous." The camera captured the family's return after nightfall, moving with obvious caution. The primary adult approached the device, and for several long minutes simply sat before it, the posture suggesting exhaustion or perhaps contemplation. Then it began to vocalize. A sequence that lasted nearly 5 minutes, the sounds rising and falling with patterns that conveyed emotion even without semantic comprehension. "We need translation," Elena said. "I know that sounds absurd, but there's structure here. We have linguists at the university who specialize in reconstructing extinct languages from fragmentary evidence. If I can convince them this is a field recording of an uncontacted population, which is technically true, they might help us parse phonemic structure, identify recurring semantic units." "That widens the circle of knowledge," Webb warned. "I'll compartmentalize, audio only, no context about species or location. Frame it as preservation linguistics for a critically endangered population," which again is completely accurate. Over the following days, Elena established secure collaboration with Dr. James Markov, a comparative linguist whose work on reconstructed Proto-Indo-European had established him as leading voice in language evolution studies. She sent him audio files stripped of identifying metadata, presented as field recordings from an isolated population in mountain region requesting anonymity. Markov's analysis returned with startling speed and even more startling conclusions. "This is remarkable," his report began. "The phonemic inventory includes sounds difficult for human vocal anatomy to produce, notably deep infrasonic frequencies and certain high-frequency modulations outside typical human range. However, the organizational structure is unmistakably linguistic. I've identified approximately 200 distinct phonemic units that combine according to apparent phonotactic rules. There's evidence of morphological structure, recurring sound clusters that function as prefixes or suffixes, suggesting grammatical marking of tense, aspect, or social relationship. Most significantly, the prosodic patterns indicate pragmatic sophistication. Different international contours appear to mark statements, questions, commands, and what might be evidential markers distinguishing direct knowledge from reported information. The report continued for 15 pages, each section reinforcing the fundamental conclusion. What Elena had recorded was language in the most rigorous technical sense. Not merely communication, but symbolic, recursive, generative language, with grammatical structure sufficient to support complex thought and cultural transmission. Based on structural complexity alone, Markov concluded, I would estimate this language represents at minimum several thousand years of evolution from a proto-language ancestor, possibly much longer. The phonological stability implied by observed morphological patterns suggests deep time continuity. This is an ancient language, Dr. Reyes, maintained by a population with remarkable cultural conservation. Elena shared the report with Webb, Cara, and Ortiz during a secure meeting at the observatory. The implications settled over them with quiet weight. If they have language with that kind of time depth, Cara said slowly, then they've been here, hidden, surviving, maintaining cultural continuity for potentially thousands of years. Through climate change, human expansion, technological development, wholesale environmental transformation, they've witnessed the entire arc of human civilization in this region while remaining deliberately apart from it. Which raises the question, Ortiz added, of how they've managed it. What adaptive strategies permitted that level of successful evasion? Eleanor thought back to the footage, the careful teachings, the demonstrated skills. They're incredibly sophisticated in their environmental knowledge, the plant processing, the tracking skills, the architectural understanding of landscape. They know these forests with intimacy that comes from generational accumulated learning. They probably have territories they've managed for centuries, understanding seasonal resources, safe travel routes, locations where human activity is minimal or predictable. And they're clearly nomadic, Webb noted. The gathering space in the footage showed signs of temporary establishment, not permanent habitation. They probably move in seasonal patterns, following resource availability while avoiding human presence. Which makes protecting them incredibly complex, Cara said. We can't establish single-location conservation sites. We'd need corridor protection, understanding of their full range, coordination across multiple land management agencies, all without revealing what we're protecting. Elena's phone buzzed with an alert from the camera monitoring system. She checked the notification, her pulse quickening. We have movement. The camera they're holding is transmitting live feed. She opened the streaming interface, and the screen filled with real-time footage from a perspective she hadn't seen before. The camera was being carried through the forest, the viewpoint bouncing slightly with each step, but carefully stabilized. It was night, the infrared rendering the landscape in shades of silver and black. The carrier approached a structure that made Elena's breath catch, a shelter built with clear engineering intent. Saplings had been bent and lashed together to form a dome frame, over which layers of bark and boughs created weather protection. The entrance faced away from prevailing winds, and a small vestibule area suggested understanding of thermal management. The camera entered the shelter, revealing interior space where 3 individuals rested, the elder, an adult, and one of the juveniles. They looked toward the camera with obvious recognition, their expressions reflecting what Elena could only interpret as welcome. The primary adult positioned the camera carefully on what appeared to be a deliberately constructed shelf, a flat stone propped on smaller rocks for stability. Then it settled before the device and began to vocalize, the sounds coming through the audio feed with clarity. Simultaneously, Elena's email alert chimed with a message from Markov. Emergency analysis. The most recent audio file you sent contains what I believe is an attempted contact phrase. Based on prosodic pattern and gestural accompaniment visible in the video metadata timestamps, I believe the speaker is trying to establish shared reference for mutual recognition. If you have any way to respond, I recommend simple reciprocation. Repeat the phrase structure with your vocal attempt, accompanied by hand gesture showing openness, non-threat. Elena looked at her colleagues, seeing her own wonder and uncertainty reflected in their faces. They're trying to talk to us, directly, deliberately. We've moved beyond observation into conversation. What do we say? Ortiz asked. We answer, Elena said. She grabbed her field recording equipment, checking audio levels, then positioned herself before her laptop's camera. We show them that we're trying, that we're listening, that we recognize the gift they're giving us. She recorded herself attempting to replicate the sounds from the latest transmission, her human vocal anatomy struggling with frequencies that sat at the edge of her range. She accompanied the sounds with her own open palm gesture, holding it for several seconds before bowing her head in what she hoped conveyed respect. Then she added spoken words, knowing semantic content would be opaque, but hoping prosody carried meaning. We understand. We want to protect you. You're not alone. They encoded the response into a file format compatible with the camera system, then transmitted it through the network, hoping the device currently in the family's shelter would receive and play the message. The waiting stretched, minutes feeling like hours. Then the live feed showed movement, the primary adult leaning forward, closer to the camera, obvious attention focused on the audio. The message played, Elena's voice and attempted vocalizations filling the shelter space. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The adult's expression transformed, features shifting into what any human would recognize as astonishment and joy. It vocalized rapidly, turning to the others in the shelter, who responded with their own sounds. Then it turned back to the camera and carefully, deliberately, repeated Elena's gesture, open palm, held steady, accompanied by a sound that Elena now recognized as phonemically significant in their language structure. We made contact, Kara whispered. First contact with a hidden hominid population, and we did it with mutual respect and consent. Over the following hours, they watched as the family group engaged with the camera, taking turns vocalizing into its microphone, showing objects, demonstrating activities. It was ecstatic, overwhelming, the kind of moment that redefined everything Eleanor understood about her field and her world. But underneath the wonder, she felt growing concern. Each transmission, each contact, deepened the relationship and deepened the responsibility that came with it. They now had not just knowledge of this population's existence, but active communication. They were involved, implicated, bound by ethics and emerging relationship to protect people who had chosen to trust them. The hunting party remained active on adjacent lands. Rumors were spreading through local communities, stories of unusual sightings and mysterious evidence. The window for maintaining secrecy was closing, and with it, the safety of the family they'd come to know through mediated technology and cross-species trust. We need a long-term strategy, Webb said. Protection that doesn't depend on our constant intervention. They need sovereignty, Eleanor said. Recognition without exposure, legal protection without classification that strips agency. Is that even possible? Ortiz asked. Elena thought about the footage she'd witnessed, the careful teaching, The deliberate contact, the trust extended across boundaries most scientists believed impossible. It has to be. They've survived this long through their own wisdom and adaptation. Our role isn't to save them, it's to become allies in their survival strategy, to use our resources in service of their self-determination. The live feed showed the primary adult settling down for rest, the camera positioned where it could monitor the shelter space. Before sleeping, the figure looked once more into the lens and raised a hand in the gesture that had become their shared language, open palm, fingers spread. A sign that transcended words and species, speaking to recognition, respect, and the fragile beginning of understanding. Elena returned the gesture to her screen, knowing the camera couldn't transmit it back, but needing to acknowledge the moment anyway. They'd crossed a boundary tonight. She and this impossible family. The footage wasn't meant for humans, but it had been given to humans, deliberately and with hope. Now came the harder work, proving that trust wasn't misplaced, that relationship could exist without exploitation, that two people separated by evolution but connected by consciousness could find a way forward together. The first lesson had been teaching. The second was conversation. The third, Elena knew, would be protection, and it would require everything they could give. The crisis arrived with a phone call 18 days after first contact. Elena was reviewing translation progress with Markov. They'd identified nearly 36 potential semantic units, including what appeared to be kinship terms and spatial relationship markers, when Webb's number flashed on her screen with emergency priority. "The hunting party found a shelter site," he said without preamble. "They're posting photos on social media, claiming evidence of large primate presence." The images are already spreading through cryptozoology forums and local news outlets. We have maybe 48 hours before this becomes a media circus. Elena's stomach dropped. Where? 2 miles west of the latest camera location. It's not the shelter we saw in the live feed, but the construction technique matches. They're mobilizing a larger search party, bringing in thermal imaging drones, dogs trained for tracking. Elena, if the family is anywhere in that watershed, they'll be found. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, grabbing her field pack with practiced efficiency. "I'm heading up there now. We need to warn them somehow, give them time to relocate." "The road access is already compromised," Webb warned. "The search party is using the main trailhead, and they've got spotters monitoring approach routes. You'll need to come in from the north, the steep access. Send me coordinates, I'll manage." The drive took 3 hours, pushed at dangerous speed on forest roads never designed for urgency. Elena's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. If the family was found, if their existence became public spectacle, every protection framework they'd carefully constructed would collapse. The legal ambiguities that currently allowed them to operate in protective secrecy would transform into jurisdictional nightmares involving wildlife agencies, federal oversight, media attention, and the inevitable exploitation that followed any discovery positioned as scientific breakthrough. But beyond the practical concerns lay something more fundamental, a betrayal of trust. The family had reached out, had chosen vulnerability, had extended relationship across the vast gap of species difference. They'd done so with intelligence and agency, making deliberate decisions about what to share and with whom. To allow that choice to result in exposure, to let their calculated risk become catastrophic consequence, was unthinkable. The northern access route was brutal, a fire lookout trail that gained elevation through switchbacks barely wide enough for hiking boots. Elena climbed with burning lungs and shaking legs, driven by urgency that overrode exhaustion. She carried minimal equipment, recording gear, emergency medical supplies, high-calorie food she hoped might serve as peace offering, and a camera preloaded with warning footage showing the search party, the drones, the organized threat. 4 hours of climbing brought her to a ridge overlooking the drainage system where both shelter sites had been found. The forest stretched below in autumn grandeur, Douglas fir and western hemlock interspersed with maple showing gold and amber. Somewhere in that vast green expanse, a family moved through familiar territory, perhaps unaware of the danger converging on their home range. Elena activated the emergency beacon they'd agreed upon during protocol planning, a specific frequency transmission that the field cameras could detect and theoretically relay. She broadcast a simple repeating message: "Contact urgent, search party active, need immediate meeting." Then she waited, watching shadows lengthen across the valley, hoping her signal would reach them in time. Twilight was gathering when she heard movement behind her. She turned slowly, hands visible and open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The primary adult emerged from the tree line with a silence that defied its size. In person, without the mediating buffer of camera and screen, the reality of its physical presence was overwhelming. It stood perhaps 7.5 feet tall, shoulders impossibly broad, covered in hair that ranged from dark brown to auburn, where fading light caught it. But what arrested Elena's attention was the face, intelligent, expressive, regarding her with obvious assessment and what she read as concern. They stood in mutual observation for several breaths. Then Elena raised her hand in their shared gesture, open palm, fingers spread, and vocalized the sounds she'd been practicing, the phrase Markov had identified as potential greeting, "Kora nim tesh." The adult's expression shifted through something like surprise, then definite pleasure. It returned the gesture, vocalizing in response, "Kora nim tesh, Elena human." Hearing her name in its voice, rendered with slight phonetic adjustment to accommodate different vocal anatomy but unmistakably intentional, sent electricity through her nervous system. They'd been learning, too, had somehow identified her through the recordings, had chosen to use that identification now. Elena pulled out the tablet, calling up the footage she'd prepared. She showed images of the search party, pointed to the valley below, used gestures she hoped conveyed urgency and danger. The adult watched intently, sometimes leaning close to study details, its breath warm and surprisingly similar to human scent, forest and earth and lived experience. When the footage ended, the adult straightened, vocalized a complex sequence of sounds, then gestured for Elena to follow. She moved immediately, trusting the intelligence that had brought them to this moment. They traveled through forest with route finding that demonstrated intimate environmental knowledge. The adult moved on game trails invisible to Elena's eyes, chose crossing points on streams with perfect rock placement, navigated terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers with fluid confidence. Elena struggled to keep pace, her human endurance a limiting factor, but the adult modulated its speed, sometimes waiting when she fell too far behind. After perhaps 90 minutes, they arrived at a location Elena recognized from the live feed, the shelter site, though now she saw it was one of several structures scattered through the small valley. This was more than temporary camp. It was a managed settlement site, showing evidence of repeated seasonal use and careful environmental integration. The family was gathering, alerted by the adult's arrival and Elena's unprecedented presence. She counted 7 individuals matching the camera footage, though seeing them in person revised every scale assumption. The elder was massive despite apparent age, moving with careful deliberation. The juveniles displayed energy contained by obvious social rules, staying close to attending adults while studying Elena with unchecked curiosity. The primary adult vocalized at length, gesturing toward Elena, toward the valley they'd crossed, making motions that suggested explanation. The family responded with their own vocalizations, a conversation playing out in language structure she recognized but couldn't penetrate semantically. Then the elder approached Elena directly, moving with gravity that commanded respect. It studied her for long moments, then reached out one hand, slowly, giving her time to retreat if she chose. Elena held still, barely breathing, as fingers longer than her own gently touched her shoulder, her face, her hand. The gesture felt like assessment and benediction both, an evaluation of her substance and character. The elder vocalized, a single phrase with falling intonation that carried finality. The primary adult responded with sounds that seemed affirmative, then turned to Elena and gestured toward the shelters. They wanted her to stay, to shelter with them, to remain through whatever came next. The trust implicit in that invitation to let a human into their most vulnerable space, to share territory and proximity, was staggering. Elena nodded acceptance, knowing she was crossing another boundary, that this moment would mark her as fundamentally changed from the person she'd been before knowledge of their existence. She followed the primary adult into the main shelter, where the family was already preparing for night. The interior space was more sophisticated than camera footage had conveyed. The floor had been covered with dried grasses and moss, creating insulation from cold ground. Stones arranged near the entrance showed signs of repeated fire use. The rocks blackened but positioned for heat reflection into the living space. Personal items were stored along the walls, bundles wrapped in bark, tools hung from bent saplings, collections of materials sorted by type and purpose. It was a home, maintained with care and cultural intent. The family had created comfort and meaning in hidden spaces, had built lives of dignity and purpose while remaining invisible to the human civilization that surrounded them. The family settled for rest, but Elena saw they maintained watch rotation, one adult always positioned near the entrance, oriented toward approaches. They were nervous, she realized, their usual routine disrupted by the hunting party's proximity, and now her presence. The primary adult positioned itself near Elena, close enough for protection but respectful of personal space. It watched her with obvious interest, and after several minutes of observation, it pulled out a bundle Elena recognized from the earlier footage. The collection of woven cordage and carved objects, their material culture made visible. It selected a small carving, running fingers over the worked surface with clear reverence, then offered it to Elena. She accepted with careful hands, studying the object in her headlamp's light. The carving depicted a figure, humanoid but clearly representing the adult species rather than human anatomy. The detail was remarkable, the proportions accurate, the facial features captured with artistic sensitivity. The adult watched her study the piece, then pulled out another carving, this one clearly representing a human, the proportions different, the features distinct. It placed the two carvings side by side, then looked at Elena with an expression she interpreted as questioning. Understanding struck her. The adult was asking about relationship, about connection between their two peoples. Were they the same? Different? How did Elena categorize the distance between them? She thought about how to respond, how to convey complex ideas across the gulf of different cognition and experience. Finally, she used gestures she hoped transcended language. She took both carvings, held them apart, then gradually brought them together until they touched. She looked at the adult and vocalized, related, connected, family, distant family. The adult's expression transformed, features shifting through what Elena read as deep emotion. It vocalized a response, sounds carrying weight of meaning she couldn't translate but felt nonetheless. Then it did something that broke her composure entirely. It placed one hand on its own chest, then reached out and gently placed the same hand on Elena's chest, over her heart. The gesture was unmistakable. We are kin. Elena felt tears spill over, her professional distance finally collapsing under the weight of recognition and relationship. Yes, she whispered, kin. They sat together in the shelter's dimness, human and not quite human, two branches of the great ape lineage that had diverged perhaps millions of years ago, yet still carried enough shared inheritance to recognize each other across that evolutionary distance. The adult's breathing was deep and steady, its presence both alien and familiar, a reminder that intelligence and personhood wore many faces. Elena must have dozed, despite intention, because she woke to pre-dawn grayness and immediate chaos. The family was moving with urgent efficiency, gathering essential items, abandoning everything else. The primary adult's hand on her shoulder, shaking her to wakefulness, vocalizing rapidly. Outside, distant but approaching, she heard the sounds of search party, dogs barking, human voices carrying through morning air, the mechanical whine of drone motors. They'd been found. The family moved immediately, each member knowing their role in evacuation. The juveniles stayed close to attending adults, carrying small bundles. The elder moved with surprising speed despite age. They abandoned the shelters without hesitation, prioritizing mobility over possession. Elena followed, her presence now obviously complicating their escape. She was slower, less capable in rough terrain, a liability in crisis. The primary adult stayed with her, sometimes physically supporting her over difficult sections, making choices that prioritized her safety even when it meant slower progress. They climbed, gaining elevation through terrain too steep for dogs to follow easily. The adult led them along a route that used rock faces and stream crossings to break scent trails, demonstrating evasion techniques refined through generations. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, sometimes closer, sometimes fading, but never disappearing entirely. By mid-morning, they'd put several miles between themselves and the shelter site, but Elena could see the toll it took on the family. The juveniles were exhausted, the elders breathing labored. They couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely, and the search party had resources, drones, radio communication, satellite phones to coordinate expanded search that would eventually overcome even sophisticated evasion. They needed intervention, the kind only Elena could provide from her side of the species boundary. During a brief rest stop, Elena pulled out her satellite phone, observatory issued, encrypted, with priority access to web. She texted rapidly, updating him on the situation, providing GPS coordinates of the search party's apparent trajectory. Webb's response came within minutes. Deploying emergency protocol. Forest Service activating flash flood warning for the drainage system. Incoming storm system. Mandatory evacuation of all recreational users. Should pull search party off-site within 2-3 hours. Can you hold until then? Elena looked at the exhausted family, at the juveniles trembling with fatigue, at the elder who'd sat down heavily and hadn't yet risen. She texted back, "We'll manage. Do whatever you need to do." The next hours tested every limit of endurance. They continued moving, but slower now, the adults taking turns carrying juveniles, Elena helping where she could despite her own exhaustion. The primary adult stayed close, sometimes vocalizing what she interpreted as encouragement or reassurance, sounds that carried weight of solidarity. The sky darkened, though Eleanor couldn't tell if it was from Webb's manufactured storm warning or actual weather. The temperature dropped, October mountain climate reasserting itself. She shared her emergency rations with the family, the food accepted with obvious gratitude, though it was wildly insufficient for their metabolic needs. By early afternoon, the sounds of pursuit had faded. Elena's phone buzzed with an update from Webb. Search party evacuated. Forest Service has closed all trail access citing weather and wildlife hazard. You're clear for now, but, Elena, this is temporary. The hunters are posting about conspiracy theories, claiming forced evacuation proves government cover-up. The story is getting traction online. She shared what she could with the primary adult through gesture and simple words, showing the phone, pantomiming departure of the search party. The adult understood, its posture shifting from tension to cautious relief. It vocalized to the others, and the entire family seemed to exhale collectively. They found shelter in a cave system the adult obviously knew well, not for habitation but for emergency refuge, a bolt hole in familiar territory. The family settled into the space with practiced efficiency, and Elena saw the resilience that had kept them surviving through centuries of human encroachment. They adapted, endured, found ways forward, even when circumstances seemed impossible. The primary adult sat beside Elena near the cave entrance, both of them watching the valley below where danger had passed, but would inevitably return. The adult vocalized quietly, sounds carrying sadness or perhaps resignation. Then it looked at Elena and gestured, a complex series of movements she interpreted as questioning. What now? Where do we go? How do we survive? Elena felt the weight of inadequate answers. The temporary reprieve couldn't last. The hunting party would return. The story would spread. The pressure would increase. Traditional conservation frameworks failed here. Protecting habitat didn't help when the species itself couldn't be acknowledged without destroying the secrecy that enabled survival. "We need to make you disappear," Eleanor said quietly, knowing semantic content was opaque but needing to speak her thoughts. "To create such complete protection that no one can find you, no matter how hard they look. We need to make the world forget you exist while ensuring you can continue living." The adult listened to her tone, if not her words, then reached into a pouch it carried, the first time Eleanor had seen clear evidence of clothing or carrying systems. It withdrew something wrapped in soft hide, handling it with obvious care. Inside the wrapping was a flat stone, palm-sized, covered with markings. The engravings were deliberate and complex. Symbols that resembled the tallies she'd seen in earlier footage, but more sophisticated, organized in clear patterns that suggested linguistic structure. The adult pointed to specific markings, vocalized corresponding sounds, then looked at Eleanor with unmistakable intent. It was teaching her to read, to understand their written language, their permanent record of history and knowledge. The adult was ensuring that even if they disappeared completely, even if no further contact proved possible, Eleanor would carry the ability to decode the messages they'd left behind, to preserve their story beyond their physical presence. The lesson continued through the afternoon, the adult showing her correspondence between sounds and symbols, demonstrating grammatical markers, creating a Rosetta Stone of cross-species communication. Elena recorded everything, knowing this might be the last opportunity, that circumstances were forcing separation neither of them chose, but both recognized as necessary. As darkness gathered, the family prepared to move again. They would travel through the night, putting maximum distance between themselves and human presence, relocating to territory unknown to Elena or her colleagues. The adult made this clear through gesture and expression. They were saying goodbye, perhaps permanent goodbye, choosing survival through deeper invisibility. Before they departed, the elder approached Eleanor one final time. It carried something bundled in bark cloth, which it carefully unwrapped to reveal additional carved stones, each covered with the symbolic writing Eleanor was beginning to recognize. The elder placed these stones in Elena's hands, then covered her hands with its own, holding the position for several breaths. The meaning was clear. This is memory, this is history, this is trust. Keep it safe. Remember us. Elena nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I'll remember. I'll protect these. I'll make sure your story survives." The elder vocalized a single word, one of the few semantic units Markov had confidently translated. Ko-nim. Remember. Then the family moved into darkness, the primary adult last to leave. It stood at the cave entrance for a long moment, silhouetted against twilight, then raised its hand in their shared gesture. Open palm, fingers spread. Elena returned it, holding the position until the figure vanished into forest shadows, merging with the environment that had protected its people through impossible centuries. She remained in the cave through the night, processing what had occurred, understanding she'd participated in something without precedent, first contact and last goodbye, compressed into a handful of days, a relationship that had to end to ensure survival. The carved stones in her pack represented responsibility beyond anything her training had prepared her for. She was now guardian of a people's history, keeper of knowledge that could never be fully shared without endangering its source. At dawn, she began the hike back to her vehicle, moving through forest that felt different now, charged with presence and absence both. She knew the family was out there somewhere, adapting their routes, refining their evasion, continuing survival strategies that had proven effective across centuries. They would persist, as they always had, in the margins and forgotten spaces, visible only when they chose to be, present but unprovable. Webb met her at the trailhead with coffee and exhausted relief. The search party is still active, but they're chasing rumors now, no concrete evidence. The shelter sites have been dismantled. Cara and Ortiz went up yesterday and removed everything that might provide DNA evidence. We've seeded false trails, created alternative explanations for the images that got posted. The story is already fading into typical cryptid noise. They're gone, Elena said, deep gone. We won't be able to find them even if we wanted to. Is that what they chose? It's what survival demanded. She pulled out the carved stones, handling them with reverence. But they left this, their history, their language, their proof of existence entrusted to our protection. Webb studied the carvings, understanding settling over his features. What do we do with it? We keep it secure. We study it with absolute secrecy. We treat it as sacred trust, not scientific specimen. And we wait, because if they choose contact again in the future, we need to be ready to respond with everything we've learned about how to be worthy of their trust. Over the following weeks, Elena worked with Markov to decode the stone writings, creating a private archive of translation and analysis that existed outside official institutional structures. What emerged was both heartbreaking and beautiful. A history of persecution and survival, of territories lost and adaptation strategies refined, of family lines maintained through population bottlenecks that should have proven fatal. The stones told of times when contact with humans had been more common, before the gun and the photograph made visibility too dangerous. They spoke of individuals who tried to build bridges, attempts at communication that ended in violence or exploitation. They recorded the decision made generations ago to retreat into complete secrecy, to become myth rather than remain vulnerable prey. But the most recent inscriptions carried different weight. They described Elena, the human who listened, and the observatory researchers who'd chosen protection over exposure. They spoke of hope, careful, tentative hope that relationship might be possible, that two peoples might find ways to coexist without one destroying the other. The final inscription, carved most recently, translated as, "We remain, we watch. We remember those who remembered us. If safety permits, we will reach out again. Until then, hold our story as we hold hope, carefully, privately, but never abandoned." Elena created a memorial of sorts in the observatory's most secure archive, the footage, the translations, the artifacts entrusted to her care. She designated it Protocol 7, First Contact Documentation, with access restricted to the core team and their designated successors. The material would be preserved, available if future contact occurred, but hidden from the exploitation and spectacle that would inevitably follow public disclosure. The hunting party eventually dispersed, their story becoming another unverified claim in the endless noise of cryptozoology forums. The shelter sites returned to forest floor, evidence erased by weather and decomposition. The family's existence receded into uncertainty, protected by the same invisibility that had preserved them through centuries of human expansion. But Elena knew. Webb, Cara, and Ortiz knew. Markov knew fragments without context. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest Mountains, a family moved through familiar territory, teaching their young the evasion strategies and survival knowledge that had kept them alive, adding to their oral history the story of humans who'd chosen to be allies rather than threats. 6 months after the last contact, Elena received a package through observatory internal mail. No return address, no explanation. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and taken from extreme distance with telephoto lens. It showed a clearing she recognized from the original footage, though from a different angle. In the center of the clearing, placed on the same flat boulder where the first camera had been returned, sat a small carved figure. Elena drove up the following day, hiking to the location alone. The carving was there, as promised, a representation of two figures, one tall and broad, one smaller and slender, standing side by side with hands raised in mirror gestures, human and other, divided by evolution, but connected by consciousness and choice. She photographed the carving, then left her own gift, a weatherproof case containing USB drives with complete archives of their translation work, copies of all footage, and a written explanation of the protection efforts undertaken on their behalf. A record of human attempts to honor the trust they'd been given. The following week, both items had vanished, but the message was clear. The family remained, the relationship remained. And in the hidden spaces of the forest, in the margins too remote for casual intrusion, two peoples continued their separate existences with shared knowledge of each other's reality. Elena returned to her work, transformed by experience into something between scientist and guardian, translator and keeper of sacred trust. She taught her graduate students about conservation ethics, about the importance of consent in research, about recognizing personhood beyond human boundaries, all without revealing the specific truth that had taught her these lessons. At night, sometimes, she would pull out the carved stones and study the script she could now partially read. She would remember the weight of a massive hand gently touching her face in benediction, the intelligence in eyes that saw her as kin, the dignity of a family choosing trust, despite every historical reason for caution. They had returned the camera, and in its footage had sent a message not meant for humans generally, meant specifically for any human capable of receiving it with respect rather than exploitation. Elena had been chosen, perhaps randomly, or perhaps because something in her protocols had suggested potential for worthy response. She had answered as best she could, had protected rather than exposed, had chosen relationship over revelation, and in doing so had participated in the most significant contact between human and non-human intelligence in recorded history, a contact that would remain unrecorded officially, preserved only in encrypted archives and memory. The story ended without resolution, because the story wasn't over. Somewhere in the mountains the family continued, and in her office Elena continued her work, waiting for whatever might come next, ready to respond with everything their trust deserved. The footage wasn't meant for humans, but it had been given to humans anyway, a bridge across impossible distance, an invitation to relationship, a test of whether one species could honor another's right to exist on their own terms. Elena intended to spend the rest of her career proving that trust wasn't misplaced, not through revelation or publication, but through the quiet, persistent work of protection and witness. Remembering those who chose to be remembered, holding their story safe until the day, if it ever came, when the world might be ready to receive it with the wonder and respect it demanded. Until then, Ko Nim, remember, she would. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community of speculative fiction lovers. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you encountered our hidden relatives? Your engagement helps us bring more thought-provoking stories to life. See you in the next one.